who think that they've wandered into the wrong Zoom room, we did send out a message yesterday, a notice to everyone who had signed up for a David Brooks conference call that unfortunately he was unable to be with us, and that we were lucky enough that Erica Brown generously stepped in to teach. Before I introduce Erica, I want to tell you very quickly that the next conference call will take place on November 19th at noon. You'll all receive information. It's going to be called Israel, Gaza, and the Media Malfunction. And it's going to be, and our guest will be Mati Friedman. And I also want to remind any of you that Erica Brown will be at our regional alumni gathering in Silver Spring, Maryland on December 7th with David Makovsky. Erica will be teaching on the centrality of Israel and Jewish tradition and it's a day which will feature networking and learning opportunities on cultivating and benefiting from critical friendships. And Angie has more material about this. I see Erica's on the move. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce her. Erica Brown's bio is very lengthy, and forgive me if I make this a little shorter. Erica's a writer and educator who consults for many Jewish organizations, including the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. She is a beloved faculty member of the Wexner Foundation, and among her many awards, she was the recipient of the coveted Covenant Award. Erica's latest books are Happier Endings, A Meditation on Life and Death, and Leadership in the Wilderness. The topic of today's call is Leadership in Crisis, Abuse of Power and Authority in the Jewish Community. We've experienced in the past weeks the unfortunate actions of a rabbi in Washington, D.C., and I'm not sure everybody is aware of the situation. But this prompted what some have called a seismic jolt of awareness, a wake-up call, and perhaps created some momentum towards change. And the onus is on all of us. Do we take personal responsibility for practices that have become corrupted? Can we create best practices for preventing abuses of power that are perpetrated all too often by people in positions of power, and according to a respected psychologist with whom we consulted, clergy of all stripes have more power than many other types of leaders. So without further ado, I turn this over to Erica Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Angie, for arranging this call. I'm sorry that I'm not David Brooks, but I have more hair. So I want to actually, these have been very difficult weeks here in the DC area. I want to give you the human sense of what's going on, because our synagogue is the suburban version of the synagogue in which Rabbi Barry Freundel was rabbi. And there are many couples who are married by him who are in our synagogue, couples who funded the mikvah, women who attended the mikvah. And I can't remember really a harder Simchat Torah on record, people really feeling the collapse of faith in the rabbinate, perhaps questioning God, questioning power, managing gossip. There's so many issues, attendance at the mikvah, whether the mikvah was a safe and secure and sacred place. So all these questions and issues kept surfacing. Obviously, every day, the Washington Post had a different report in the Metro section, to the extent that people said, is there anything else people in Washington are talking about? And the ramifications of this behavior have yet to be fully understood. Rabbinical councils are organizing themselves to respond appropriately, and it's hard to know, how to respond appropriately. So what I wanted to do is take us into some Jewish sources that deal with the issue of hypocrisy. And as Cindy wisely pointed out, the question of abuse of power takes on a special and particularly pernicious let's say, pernicious sort of perspective for many people when it's a rabbi or member of clergy who commits the abuse. Emily Dickinson has a lovely poem where she talks about a very special plate that you put on the highest shelf. And the problem is when the plate falls, it shatters fabulously. And I think that I've really had many conversations, really hours a day of conversations in the past weeks with people who feel that that special plate fell and shattered into thousands of pieces. I want to start. I prepared a small source sheet for this this afternoon, and I want to start with Deuteronomy, Devarim 6:18. Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you. And it's interesting, this idea, when you take apart the verse as we've been taught in Wexner, this idea of doing right and good in the sight of the Lord, which means it's not necessarily doing right and good in within our own worldview, but some broader perspective of rightness and goodness that we answer in the words of the Hebrew National hot dog commercial. We answer to a higher authority. And the idea that when you do good and right, it goes well with you. But if you don't do good and right, it does not go well with you. And so part of this is focusing on systemic sort of abuses of power that happen within a system, because a system of hierarchy doesn't necessarily allow for feedback to travel upwards as it travels downwards. And part of it for me is trying to help people understand and understanding myself how to respond as a citizen to organizational abuses and abuses that have gone on for such a long time. So actually, I want to share with you just a little personal vignette. After the Bernie Madoff scandal, I would say for roughly 6 months after the Bernie Madoff scandal, virtually every class that I taught involved this scandal. Not because it was being tackled directly, but because people kept questioning how to respond to this. And when trust is broken, organizational trust is broken, what should we do? And so I called my publisher at the time was Stuart Matlins and Jewish Lights. I just finished a book on boredom, and then suddenly life got a lot less boring. And I told him that I felt that there needed to be a book on this. I didn't want to write it, but was someone else writing it? And he said no. And he said, frankly, it's June. He was convicted in December. The publishing window is over. This is not a story that's had a long life. Well, of course, 1 month later was the New Jersey sting operation, where rabbis of all stripes, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, and those who lived in New Jersey and New York and Australia, were involved in money laundering of a particularly pernicious degree. And I called Stuart and I said, Stuart, did you see the front page of the New York Times? And he said, yes. And he said, write the book. So I wrote this book on scandal, confronting scandal. It was the hardest book I've ever written, and I wrote a book on death. It was just ugly. It felt dirty. It felt wrong. And in the process of writing the book, I was in contact with some New Jersey reporters who were working on the scandal. And they were also writing a book that has subsequently come out. And they shared with me an FBI transcript of what took place in one of these interactions. And the journalist said to me, do you watch The Sopranos? And I said, no, I don't really have much time for television. And he said, well, in The Sopranos, when money is laundered, when a money laundering transaction takes place, $1,000 is called a box of ziti. He said, when you read the transcript that I'm about to send you, $1,000 of money laundering is called a gemara. And the transaction will take place in a place called the mikvah. And sure enough, taking our more than cultural, our religious terminology, our spiritual terminology, and turning it into a vehicle, a tool for abuse, because these things were previously sacred. No one would touch them. And sure enough, I read the transcript, which is public information, and there was something so deeply painful. Had it said box of ziti, I wouldn't have had the same response. But as someone who studies the Talmud daily, this feeling that someone had taken my terminology, things that were holy to me, and ripped it apart in this way was particularly offensive. So I'm going to ask Angie if she can put on the first text for us onto the screen. which will certainly be preferable to seeing me. And I want to read a text for you, and I'll read it for you as Angie is putting it up. This is a piece of Talmud from the Babylonian Talmud Yoma, which is generally about the principles of Yom Kippur, 23a. And here we go. The following incident occurred with two priests who were both in the same place as they ran and ascended the ramp. This is obviously in the days of the temple. When one of them came within 4 cubits, approximately 6 feet of the altar, before his colleague did, the second one took a knife and drove it into his colleague's heart, killing him. So this is probably a legendary story. Hopefully it never took place. But the idea is that there were two priests who were competing for their service of God. And when one won the competition up the ramp to offer the sacrifice, the other one murdered him. All the people burst out weeping. Of course they did. The father of the slain boy came, and he found him writhing on the floor. He said, "May he be an atonement for you. My son is still writhing, and therefore the knife did not become impure." This serves to teach you that they regarded the purity of the vessels more seriously than murder. And I think what the text is pointing at is that even after the murder took place, they were worried about the kashrut, about the appropriateness of the knife, meaning they simply bifurcated their religious lives and totally lost perspective on what was true and good. And I wanted to share with you, because it was so striking, the observation made by Dr. Leslie Lothstein, who's a psychologist who treated 300 Roman Catholic priests and generally treated priests who had fathered more than one child and had sought out abortions for the women. He asked priests why they had not used protection, and they were told, and he was told, because birth control is against the law of the church. Meaning that again, that bifurcation takes place where certain things seem permissible. The Talmud says when one performs a sin 3 times, naseh bo keheter, it's as if you're doing it with permission. And this particular therapist included in his treatment, particularly of pedophilia, the tried to make them aware that infraction took place in multiple ways, that they were dividing up, if you like, their religious lives in ways that didn't inform each other. And he says, if they don't have a conscience, you try to give them a mentalizing function to help them imagine other people's feelings. So in working with clergy, this sense that people needed a mentalizing function, they simply closed off certain behaviors and really did not investigate themselves with regard to those behaviors. And that takes us to the source in Isaiah, which should also be on your source sheet. I will read it to you. If Angie can put it up, that'd be terrific. This is the first chapter of Isaiah. For me, this is perhaps, I would say this is the clarion call of Jewish morality. And I'm going to read you a little before, the multitude of your sacrifices. That's it. Perfect. So that's Isaiah 11 to 17. But I want to read you a little bit before that, a text that perhaps you may not have. God says, "Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing." Occasions when you would normally come to the temple, these would be holy occasions. They have become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. When you lift up your hands, I'll turn my eyes away from you. You pray at length, I won't listen. Why won't I listen? Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves clean. Put away evil doings. Away from my sight. And now we get to the text. You should have. I'm using a slightly different translation, the JPS, but you'll have this text right in front of you. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wrong. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. So this idea of stop doing wrong, learn to do right, makes an assumption. And the assumption is that people don't always know how to do right. And it's not enough to tell people, do what is right. You have to actually bring people into a posture of goodness by teaching them goodness. I one of the things that was very striking to me about the response to the book that I wrote, Confronting Scandal, is how little anyone really cared. I actually went on a book tour. It was the only time I went on a book tour. I went to 19 cities. I went to Albuquerque, San Diego, New Jersey. I went up and down the Amtrak corridor. And I felt that we had to have an organized response to the breach of ethics in our community. And the 5 people who would come to the talk, and no one, of course, bought the book. The 5 people who came to the talk would say, "It's so good, honey, that you're doing something about this problem." And so the process, it wasn't only a process of writing the book, it was really thinking about why people aren't responding, why people don't care, or they're shipping this off to someone else to take care of. And I put on the handout, if Angie, you could go back to the handout for a moment, one of the responses, and then I'd like to take questions and your comments. If you go down, what about the victims of abuse? I just wanted to translate the term vulnerable. I know that we use it often, but I wanted to, Angie, could you move it slightly to the right so I can see it on my screen? Or is that, no, too hard? I just see your face, which is lovely. But if you see here, the being capable or susceptible to being wounded or hurt as by a weapon, open to moral attack, criticism, temptation, open to assault, difficult to defend. I think when rabbis commit crimes, getting back to the, thanks. The sense, what allows them to hurt us, and I think what allows them to hurt us is that synagogues and Jewish organizations generally are associated with caring for the vulnerable. And because these are people and institutions which care for the vulnerable, and they're supposed to be safe and sacred spaces, we make ourselves vulnerable in the presence of clergy. And therefore, we're not always in a position to morally defend ourselves. I wanted to just think about some reflective questions with you. And that is, in reading the definition, think about a time when you felt particularly vulnerable, but particularly vulnerable in the presence of a leader. Describe the circumstances, the emotions, and what you did about that feeling. One of the reasons that Barry Freundel was caught is that certain people who were very vulnerable, converts who were very vulnerable, began to question whether or not the language that was being used was appropriate. And they began to suspect that perhaps something was wrong, even though they had withheld their suspicion. If you like, they put their suspicion in suspension for a long time. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we don't have organizing mechanisms in sacred positions to really have proper oversight. And I think that, as Cindy pointed out before, rabbinical councils are starting to look into oversight. It's hard when you don't have set standards of behavior to hold people accountable to that behavior, because in many ways, our rabbis are the ones who set the standard. Now we're starting as lay people to understand that perhaps we have to set a standard that both our clergy and ourselves are held accountable to. So I want us to think about vulnerability, think about people who make us particularly vulnerable, think about when we let down our guard, and what happens when morally we let down our guard simply too far. And just to conclude with the sense, let us learn to do good, as Isaiah says. What institutions, what mechanisms, what learning, what study opportunities do we put in place for ourselves and our children to learn to do good, without assuming that everyone knows what goodness is and it does not have to be taught? Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Angie, so for people who want to ask questions, they unmute themselves. The mute button is the microphone on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And let's take some questions. We have 18 minutes. You want to raise your hand if you have a question? Or make a noise? Yes, unmute yourself.
I did it.
Oh, there she goes. Never mind. Oh, it's me. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you very much for speaking today. How do you truly address this issue when
the rabbis, at least in the Orthodox community and in the RCA, they're the ones that are setting the standards, be it kashrut, halakha for business. They're the Beit Dins, and if there's inherent problems, but yet they are the arbiters of halakha and know the standards, how can I as a layperson really come in and dictate anything? How would that even work?
It's an excellent question, and I don't think it's a question only for Orthodox institutions, because I think all of us belong to Jewish organizations where we don't necessarily know what ethics policies and standards are in place. And many organizations have them already, and if they don't have them, they need them. So the idea that a layperson actually puts pressure not to have the oversight, but to demand an understanding of what kind of oversight mechanisms are in place, are contact numbers given if there was any question about the integrity of a particular leader. Who do you speak to? And a lot of us really have no idea who one would speak to if there was some breach of faith. And of course, most rabbis are really upright, upstanding role models for their communities. This only happens in the breach. But the question is, what mechanisms are created in the breach? Right now, the RCA has been putting out virtually daily different responses that they have, organizing panels on ombudsman. It's unfortunate that this happens as a result of scandal, and it can't happen before that. But whatever the motivator is, it's important for all of us as lay people to push on the professional Jewish community and ask, help me understand what credibility you have by understanding what ethical standards you have in place, and how do you have oversight over them. I mean, I as many of you know, I wrote an article in the New York Jewish Week, which traveled quickly, about synagogues having annual performance reviews for rabbis. Many people, and again, lay people said, oh, I want to know if my synagogue does that. And some people said, oh, but their rabbis are sacred. They're on our pedestal, and we don't review them the way that we review everyone else. You know, I'm not instituting the actual policy, but I'm suggesting that this is a policy issue, and that you need to make sure, every layperson needs to make sure or check what oversight is in place over our rabbi. You know, with respect, of course, with respect for the position, but sometimes we respect the individual rabbi and then lose respect for the institution of the rabbinate, when the rabbinate as an institution doesn't have mechanisms, checks and balances for abuse of power.
Anybody who asks for the next question, please introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Good idea.
Questions?
Comments?
Hi, it's Karen Heron.
Hi.
My question is about nonprofit organizations. How would you translate what you just said to looking at leadership within nonprofits where it's all lay leaders and nobody's a salaried employee?
Well, very often a nonprofit will have some number of salaried employees, and many large nonprofits also have some kind of ethical standard document in place. Sometimes they have emergency telephone numbers in case there are abuses, or committees that actually handle this. But I would say that the appointment of a task force or a committee to have oversight over issues of integrity and ethics within practice. But again, if you don't have standards in place, you can't complain that people are breaching the standard. So I think that the conversation isn't really ultimately about clergy. It's ultimately about CEOs. It's really ultimately about how we as lay people institute frameworks for and standards so that we can actually ask someone to observe this standard, because that's information that's transparent and public.
But I'm confused. If you say there needs to be standards in place, aren't some things just common sense? Doesn't it just scream inappropriate? Do we have to wait for standards to be in place to be able to make a judgment call, or to call the question?
Yeah. Well, you would think so. I think Isaiah would think so, but Isaiah said, learn to do good, meaning we can't assume that our standards of integrity are shared by everyone. Or, for example, how do you know what's a red flag? I think that's one of the questions that I've been asking a great deal, because many people who knew this particular rabbi closely, and I include myself as one of them, knew that he had issues with power, that he had bullied a number of people in the community, he bullied institutions in the community. These are all red flags. And what I wrote in my article is that this was not a crime of intimacy; it was a crime of power. And so some of those mechanisms were, or some of those red flags were up long ago. So I think you're right, Cindy. Common sense should dictate this. But what happens when your view of what is inappropriate might not be my view of what's inappropriate? So if we have that documented and we have a shared agreement and there's a partnership, if you like, I think the better term for us as Jewish organizations is the covenant, the ethical covenant that we create between professionals and lay people about what the standard of behavior is. Because then you can hold someone accountable to it. And you can say, I want to make sure that everyone on our board knows this is the standard, and this is what we expect from our board members, this is what we expect from our president, this is what we expect from our chief executive. And anyone who is not honoring that, we turn to that document and we say, there's been a breach of covenant here. What are you going to do about it? But unfortunately, I think there was actually an obituary for common sense. I think you can write obituary for common sense, and you'll get an entertaining read.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Susie Sorkin, and I have a question. You talked about being vulnerable, and how do you, in the sense, is it possible to create a practice where our children and other adults are looking out for people who are vulnerable in general or themselves, and learn how to speak out for other people so that these people don't feel alone in these kinds of situations? And
yeah, Susie, thank you. That's an excellent question. I would say here in particular, in this instance, people who were most vulnerable were converts. Because they weren't operating within community. They didn't yet understand what community norms of behavior were. The rabbi is very often the sole steward of that journey. And so the power that a rabbi in that position has over an individual is immense. And so I would say that for me, I guess, because your question is quite general, if I were to make it more specific, I'd say we need to make sure that the process of conversion is not a process of two people, the teacher and the student or the mentee. It really has to involve a lot of people in the community. I think converts really didn't know how to challenge what they were told in this instance. And it's unfortunate, but here, converts in this community were told, use the mikvah multiple times to practice. And we know that that's not the case. Had they asked anyone else, they would have gotten a different answer. But I think what happened was they were so gullible and vulnerable at that point. So I'm really concerned about how we protect converts in the process, because I can tell you, having spoken to a number of converts this past week, even if their conversions are deemed still valid, the feeling of violation is so pervasive and it's so deep. And how do you help people say, how do you help people feel that their journey to Judaism was still a beautiful journey, even though it's been violated in this way? I'm not really sure how. Maybe I'll turn the question back to you, which is an old teacher trick, Susie. How would you protect vulnerable? How would you suggest we do it?
It's a very good question, and I continue to look to, my kids, for example, because that's who I'm teaching, right? I'm not teaching students, right? In the sense of, how do I teach them that if they see something that is not right, not to do it, or not to speak up, badly about somebody who might be vulnerable even on the streets, right? And so to make it a practice that they're looking out for someone else. Now, the situation in this case is very particular in terms of converts, and it's not something I'm very familiar with, so I can't really speak to the situation at hand, but I do agree that definitely processes need to be in place so that more people, first of all, they're joining a community. I'm surprised that it was a one-on-one to begin with, but that's my naivete, my sense.
Well, I don't think converts are alone the whole time. But I think early on in the process, we believe that a convert is like a new baby in the sense that they are disconnected from their birth families, and we treat them as if they have just kind of emerged into Judaism as children, even though they're adults. And so I would say that they are operating within a community, but the chief or the lead in their process and their journey is this particular custodian, and that can become very problematic. But in terms of kids, my youngest is 13. We had a long conversation about how do you know? She said, well, what's the problem with looking at other people? And, I had to explain a whole host of vocabulary words that she didn't know. I don't actually know how to spell voyeur, but the idea that you're explaining what's wrong with it. Why would non-Jews be interested in this, and why would they put it in the newspaper? And then talking a little bit about when other children say inappropriate things, or when adults say inappropriate things, we actually have to define what inappropriate is. Hannah Rosen just wrote a very large piece on sexting, and it's gotten a lot of radio and print attention, media attention, and justifiably so, because maybe the norm has changed for our kids and for ourselves about what is permitted. I heard some absurd conversations this past week. Well, if it had only been pornography, as if pornography is the new ethical standard, if it had only been pornography and not abuse of the congregants' trust in this way. So I'm not sure if the sands are shifting morally and what inappropriate behavior is. So I think it's important to define that for ourselves and for our families.
Erica, I want to take a certain prerogative. There's some graduate fellowship alumni who are leaders of organizations on the call. So Joe Konofsky, can I call on you and ask you what you have experienced in past? Do you know how to unmute yourself? Yes, you did it. Joe is a pulpit rabbi and in Toronto. And I just wonder your reaction and sitting in a seat of authority and power.
Just Cindy, sharpen it for me just a little bit about institutional responses, personal accountability, or how do you mean exactly?
Yes.
My concern in this is that we're trying to put institutional, not safeguards, but we're trying to solve a problem institutionally that at the end of the day is a personal issue. Personal accountability, I think, can't be ultimately to a professional organization or to a set of guys. It needs to be that also, but it's a question of personal integrity and realizing when someone, reading the signs that someone is, I'm operating outside of my boundaries, or I'm pushing professional relationships beyond where it's appropriate for them to go, and so on. Having seen what we've seen, unfortunately, in case after case, let's talk about the Catholic Church, because it's much easier to talk about them than talk about us. The people who will ultimately investigate and who will mete out punishment and who will make reassignments are the guys on your team, right? They're your chevra, they're your buddies. So of course the instinct is going to be to downplay it and to smooth everything over and to say that it's not such a big deal. The only thing the thing I've heard that makes the most sense is that people suggest that there be an independent outside third party examiner who serves as an ombudsman or a clearinghouse for these kind of complaints. So I guess since those things don't really exist, maybe on a global scale in the Jewish world, maybe that's one option that hasn't been tried yet. But I think the finding or looking for institutional solutions to what's ultimately a personal accountability problem to my own integrity as a rabbi, as a person, as a citizen, I think we may not be getting the optimal results that we're hoping for.
Response to that?
Well, thank you, Joe. I mean, obviously, the integrity piece is personal. The question is what platform the particular individual has in order that can be potentially compromised. I did a lot of reading about scandal in the Catholic Church when I was working on my book on scandal. And one thing that seems apparent from a book called Supreme Authority are when you create certain hierarchical structures, it becomes very hard for feedback to work from down to up, as opposed from up to down. And the sense that the rabbi knows best, that there's judgment only in one direction, can lead culturally to certain abuses of power. So while we'd like to measure everything by virtue of personal integrity, we don't always know. I can tell you that I'm co-chairing the search for our next rabbi, and this issue now we feel very fragile right now, and there's a lot of healing that has to take place. And the question, well, how will we know when we interview people who we assume have personal integrity, who come with good references? How do we know? And so my concern is that when people are in place, I don't think you know now. I don't think that that crimes that have been committed, even by the people right now or in the newspaper, I don't think they ever saw themselves ever capable of doing those things. I don't think Elliot Spitzer saw himself capable of it. It was not leadership outside of the Jewish realm, in the political realm or the business realm. I think if you ask most people, could you imagine yourself 10 years from now being guilty of this? I think they'd say no. But as Tiger Woods said when in his public apology, I crossed the boundary of what I thought was acceptable. And that only happens when you give people power, and they have some kind of permission. They feel some kind of permission that they don't have to answer to the same rules as everybody else. And that's very concerning to me.
I want to be respectful of Erica's time and everybody else's time. Erica, how much time do you have left to give us?
I really wanted to end with a thought, and I thank Rabbi Joe for his insight and on personal integrity. And I want to share the verse that always comes to mind when I think about these issues. Do not profane my holy name, and I'll be sanctified in the midst of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. And I'm very struck by this verse in Leviticus that connects sanctifying God's name with just not profaning it. In other words, it's true that we've got to do our best as leaders in the Jewish community, as thinkers, as citizens of the community, as parents, to sanctify and to be sanctified. But at the very, very least, we can still be sanctified if we don't profane. And I think we have to think about what that means in our community. What does it mean to profane something that's holy? How do we introduce notions of holiness as a bar and a standard for our behavior? Thank you, Cindy.
Erica, thank you so much for jumping into this within the last 24 hours. Thank you, Angie and Eliza, for helping brief Erica on how to do it. And thanks everybody on the call. I'm sure there are a lot of more questions that were raised. And I think a lot of soul searching, because I believe it's not only up to a body that has yet to be created, an oversight body, but I think that there's personal obligation that we need to take upon ourselves in terms of alertness, awareness, and being part of the Jewish people and responsibility. So not that we should all go out all of a sudden on horseback and start wreaking havoc, but I think that we just can't wait, and we have to see ourselves as part of the solution. So